Thank you. There's so many parts of this job that are fabulous, but one of the best is suggesting people I get to speak to. So I was so thrilled when David said, like, sure, I'll come to Chicago. We were like dancing in the office. So thank you, David. We're so glad that you agreed to this. I just have to say thank you. So many people, I'll do that later, but Daniel Holtz, every time I come back from a conversation, my poor kids, I'm always like, do you want to be a physicist? And they're like, well, you know, I think I'm going to go into business. And I'm like, how about gravitational waves? They're really cool. And they're like, Mom, I'm not going to be. And I was like, no, really, you should just think about it. Just go Google it. It's so fascinating. So I'm doing my best, Daniel. David, thank you for being here tonight. I love your novels. I read your column regularly. I've only read 3 of your 12 novels, but I feel like that's kind of a lot. And I'm still at it. I recommend it to everyone. And if you haven't gotten a book, grab it on your way out. And if he's still hanging around, make him sign it. So let's just dive right in. It must not be easy to write fiction and write a column, and you probably have to be somewhat careful. But let's just start on like the big picture. Why write fiction when you have the outlet of your column, and what challenges does that pose?
So I want to just begin by saying I can't wait to tell my grandchildren that I visited Hogwarts. I mean, this room is incredible. And second, I have to note that during dinner, I asked Daniel Holtz, who says he's really reading my book, that if he finds a howling mistake in it, he will tell me so that I can correct it in the paperback edition and give him appropriate credit. So I started writing novels in 1987. I never had any real ambition to be a novelist, but I came across a story as a journalist that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal about how the CIA had recruited and run Yasser Arafat's chief of intelligence as an American agent for almost 10 years. And after the story came out, the person who ran that operation was killed in the Beirut embassy bombing in 1983. And I ended up learning so much about that operation that I thought, you can't write a 100,000-word, newspaper story about this. You'd have to try to write fiction. So I began really from my journalism with a story I couldn't tell any other way, and that was my first novel, Agents of Innocence, in 1987. And when it came out, and it had some success. It was telling a real story, and people kind of knew that. And I thought, okay, this is a fork in the road. You really have to choose whether you're going to be a novelist, this new career that's opened up, or remain as a journalist. And I just couldn't make up my mind. I love my journalism. To be honest, I was afraid. I had young children, and I didn't think I'd make enough money. I didn't really see myself as Tom Clancy. So people always say, okay, it's a fork, you have to make a choice. And I couldn't, and I didn't, and thank goodness I didn't, because I have continued to do both. The idea of not having written my column for all these years, it's hard for me to imagine. Not having written the 12 novels and had a way to unpack the ideas that I write about in my journalism, in a way where you don't have to, it's not condensed into 800 words. You don't have to conclude by saying, and so, what policymakers should do is this. You can just let life be as complicated as it really is. That's been a joy. So the two just ended up feeding off of each other, Rachel. It's sort of, like a lean-to. Each ended up supporting the other, not being at war. And I just told my publisher I'd write 2 more. So, more coming.
Yay. I read Agents of Innocence. That was the first one I read. It was fantastic. Read them all. They're fantastic. So let me. I want to get to space because that's what Phantom Orbit is about. But before we get there, picking up on this and what you just said, I heard you speak at Aspen this summer, And Ernie Moniz, the former Secretary of Energy, was there. And he asked you how you could get such technical details correct. To your point of asking Daniel about howlers, that when Ernie Moniz asks somebody how they get the details correct, your ears perk up because he's asking something really serious. So how do you have this broad network of contacts, and how do you use that to make your fiction so good, but how do you not compromise those relationships for when you need them for your columns? Like, how do you navigate the fiction and nonfiction part of that?
So in conversations with sources in the intelligence world, I will sometimes say, I'm asking this question as a novelist. This won't end up in my journalism. And I try to keep to that. I've been doing this a long time. I first started writing about the CIA in 1978. If people have heard the name James Jesus Angleton, the legendary chief of counterintelligence, as a young man of 29, I used to go to lunch with him, just brash kids. So I'm doing this a long time. I try to keep faith with people. Although I'm drawing on real intelligence operations, the things people tell me, I always say to people, if you think you're reading a recipe for how to bake a cake, you're going to end up with a mud pie, because there's just so much junk that's thrown in by me as a novelist that I don't really worry about giving away the store. When I start work on a book, I'll take the most recent one as an example. I was one of the people who thought it made sense to create a space force. That was back during Trump's presidency. A lot of people, if Trump liked it, a lot of people said it must be a terrible idea. But the more I looked at it, it seemed that the Air Force, which was responsible for space, was really so focused on its core mission. It was a service that's almost always run by fighter pilots, and they have that kind of acculturation and thinking about space and the super complicated issues involved in space weapons, space defense, just wasn't the first priority for the Air Force. So I talked to the first head of the Space Force, General Raymond. There's a wonderful organization some people in this room may know called the Aerospace Corporation, which is a kind of Lawrence Livermore Laboratory-like institution that serves the National Reconnaissance Organization as an advisor. I spent time there, and they were incredibly generous in opening up how they think about the physics of warfare in space, which is a subject I go into in some detail in the book. So, this process, I'm a reporter at heart, so I just, seeing people, asking questions, making notes, asking people, if you were writing a novel about space, what would you put in it? And you get General Raymond, the head of the Space Force, to answer that. It's pretty interesting. So that's kind of how I did it.
So speaking about space, just a few months ago, we were at the Arts Club, and David and Lynn Weinberg were hosts there. And what focused my attention is you talked about space as a future battlefield. And you said then that some think that there's a space race brewing, and some think that we're 2 years into that space race. And I was struck because our Science and Security Board is a bit divided on that. And we do have a member who has been saying for a few years, like, we're already in a space race. And I went up to you afterwards and said, my Science and Security Board, a number of people think we're already in it. And your book opens with one of the main characters, Ivan Volkov, writing to the CIA from Russia. And he writes, quote, "A war has already begun in space. You, America, think you understand it, but you do not. The worst has already happened." So can you help us understand the contours of that debate?
So in that opening scene in the book where Volkov decides he has to send a message to the CIA to warn them, That's about something that hasn't happened. A threat, as Daniel knows, to the basic architecture of the GPS systems. What I meant when I said that I think the first space war has begun is that in the Ukraine war, I've visited Ukraine now 5 times since the war began. And on 2 of those visits, I've embedded with Palantir, which is a company that's done more to help the Ukrainian military operate against this overwhelming Russian adversary than maybe any other company. And sitting with Palantir and the Ukrainian military, I've looked at a computer screen where the Ukrainians can dial down from the commercial satellite coverage that's available, optical imagery, thermal imagery, synthetic aperture radar imagery, go down the list. Everything that used to be the super secret government agency product is now commercially available and can be purchased and is being purchased. And if Ukraine says, there are only 12 orbits that we bought over Kherson or Bakhmut in the next 24 hours, and we need more, they can add to. You can literally watch all the different commercial orbits that will be available to them on this dashboard. And the reason that the Ukrainians can communicate with their troops in the front line and fire missiles, other munitions at the Russians is thanks to Elon Musk's Starlink satellites. If they didn't have those, they couldn't communicate. The Russians, as the war started, tried to jam the systems. They failed in the initial effort, but for Starlink, I think they would have succeeded. So Ukraine depends on this commercial small satellite revolution, the 3,000 plus satellites that Musk has up, the many other satellites that other companies have. And the Russians know it. And in the first year of the war, people didn't notice this, but a Russian diplomat said at the UN, we regard these commercial low Earth orbit satellites as military targets if they supply military information to our adversaries. It was a chilling warning that they were seeing this as a zone of conflict in this war they were fighting with increasing intensity. And we know that now, thanks to Mike Turner, the congressman from Ohio, who demanded a briefing, that the Russians have a plan to launch a satellite with a nuclear weapon on board that could disable low Earth orbit satellites. My own guess is that the idea that they just explode a bomb and the debris would blow, prevent the low Earth orbit satellites from, I think that's less likely than that they would be able to disable through, some kind of electromagnetic pulse the electronics of those satellites. I think that's a more likely scenario. But the point is, for Ukraine and Russia, space is an absolutely crucial part of this war. And it just concerns me because I think without realizing it, we have entered a new era of warfare. It's super dangerous, and it's also so classified in the United States, we don't know really anything about what the weapons that we're developing to combat what our adversaries are doing.
So one more question related to Phantom Orbit, then we're going to go to the election. Then if there's time, we're going to do a round robin around the world. We will have time for a couple questions from the audience, so please start thinking about your questions. The last one on this, I was going to ask you about Russia, but because your novel it's about the US, the CIA, Russia, and China, I was struck, we were talking in our meeting today, and someone brought up that the head of Space Force has talked about China's mind-boggling activities in space. Can you talk a little bit, you just talked a little bit about what's China up to?
So China has been very aggressive. The book, after this warning from the Russian, dials back in time to 1995 in China, where the Russian, in this bankrupt post-Soviet Russia, has to go study at Tsinghua University in Beijing. At that time, China had basically nothing going in space. It had a little satellite that orbited the Earth playing The East is Red. That was pretty much it. But they knew that space was going to be crucial. They'd watched the 1991 Gulf War. They knew that satellite-guided precision munitions were the future of warfare. So the book imagines, and I think not without reason, that the Chinese back then began to think, how can we penetrate the supply chain for America's overwhelmingly dominant space presence so that the little things that go into the big systems, China has a point of entry. And as we've seen, the Chinese are incredibly skillful at penetrating our systems. It turns out they've been in our Verizon phone systems. What haven't they penetrated? So that's the way the book imagines the Chinese getting started. They conducted their first anti-satellite weapon test in 2007, back at a time when I think Americans and everybody around the world still thought of space as benign. This idea that it was a zone of warfare hadn't occurred to people, but the Chinese were moving forward. High-powered microwaves, directed energy, will be crucial in space warfare. You can inject code as you pass a satellite using high-powered microwaves, I believe. I've seen it happen on Earth, through a brick wall. Chinese were incredibly early in developing high-powered microwaves and directed energy in terms of patents, and then it all disappears. So they've been very aggressive. A lot of the details that I know I put in the book, so I gotta tease you a little bit to read the book and find out exactly all the crazy weapons that they have up in space. But they're very aggressive, well past the Russians, our Space Force is trying, as hard as it can to figure out what they're doing and then compete with it.
So let's go to the election. So that's what our Space Force is up to. At dinner, we were talking a little bit, and you mentioned that Trump's a bit of a paradox. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So, we're probably all Trump saturated. This has been just an exhausting week. The week before the election, I was in Lebanon. And when I got back, I said to some friends, it was so much less stressful to be in a real war zone than it is in this sort of psych ward of American politics. And
psych ward.
My wife couldn't bear to listen to the radio, and she heard Trump on the TV. She'd walk out. So the election result was more decisive than I think anybody imagined. When I spoke to you of the paradox of Trump, here's what I was talking of. Obviously, Trump is a tremendously worrisome individual. All of his bad personal qualities we watched for 4 years when he was president. There's nothing about him that, in a sense, that we don't know about his threats, the danger he poses to my profession, to the First Amendment, the danger he poses to the efforts to deal with climate change. I mean, go down the list, all the things that he is threatening to do, the mass deportations. I mean, we all have seen it, thought about it, anguished about it. But one interesting thing about his campaign is that he was in many ways, the anti-war candidate. Again and again, he would say, there are too many wars in the world. When I become president, I'm going to solve the Ukraine war, before I even get elected. He apparently called Netanyahu last summer and said, I want the Gaza war over by the time I take office. I don't want, there are too many wars. He would repeatedly say, the world is blowing up. If you look at his record in talking about nuclear weapons, surprisingly, going back 15 years in what I was able to look at, he has been warning of the danger of nuclear weapons. It's strange. You think of Trump as this, ultimate, reckless actor, but he's actually been worried about nuclear weapons, proliferation, nuclear war. That's his standard line about Ukraine. This is going to be World War III. We have to stop this. I think that was part of his appeal to a country that is tired of war. In America, after Iraq and Afghanistan, people pretty much have had it with foreign wars. There's been support for Ukraine, but it's reluctant, and certainly among Trump voters. So I think that's, when I say the paradox, it's that this reckless, dangerous man also says, there are too many wars and I'm going to try to settle them. The challenge that I wrote about in a column a couple days ago is, let's take him at his word. He's right, there are too many wars. That's true. So how can they be settled without the U.S. compromising its values, its allies, making concessionary deals to, I think Putin is the most ruthless and dangerous character on the world stage. How do you settle the Ukraine war in a fair way so that Putin doesn't end up the winner? So that's the way I'd look at it. The idea that Trump is just a warmonger, just a reckless, when you set the clock, I'll be very curious how you factor in that part of Trump, the Trump that says, there are too many wars and I'm going to end them. Because that's part of what got him elected, I suspect.
So, excuse me, let's stay on that, actually. Let's begin our kind of tour around the world. And that actually segues into, kind of thinking about the Middle East, something you've thought a lot about. And I've been reading a lot about it too. And in the Middle East, there's a lot of support for Trump. We know that. We know it's a region many are comfortable with autocratic tendencies. The many who will be important in the Trump administration, whether it's Jared Kushner or Steven Mnuchin or who have huge fortunes that they've made in the UAE and Saudi. Netanyahu was one of the first phone calls he made, seems to think he's going to do a good job. There is just, I don't know, excuse me, I don't remember, it's the Post or the Times, I'm sure it was the Post, where they were kind of talking about the Iranians. There's two camps. They're like, this guy's a deal maker. Maybe we can get on the same side with him. But at the same time, the Saudis also remember that I think in 2019, the Iranians shelled their oil facilities and the Trump administration didn't do anything. And so in the sense that he's not a war maker, but maybe he is an appeaser, what are you hearing from your colleagues in the Middle East about how they're understanding both the risks of a Trump administration and the opportunities?
So in the Middle East, and I'd say around the world, people are desperately trying to suck up to Trump. It's amazing, the number of phone calls and pleas, and the people might as well fly those little airplanes with banners over Mar-a-Lago, advertising their countries. And that's certainly true in the Middle East. Trump is the consummate deal maker. His narcissism is focused, I think, on delivering these big deals. He did one in his first term, the so-called Abraham Accords, which, Jared Kushner negotiated it, but I think it's great. It has opened the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain to Israel. There's real communication. People don't realize it, but when Iran launched all those missiles at Israel in April, and then again more recently, there's an integrated radar air defense network that has all of the Gulf Arab countries, from Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, et cetera, through to Jordan and Egypt, that's integrated with the Israeli air defense system. They're all invisibly, secretly working together. So the idea that you could take that the next step and have a big deal, a la Trump, certainly is imaginable. My fear, and it was reinforced today in a comment by the most right-wing and scary of of Netanyahu's supporters, named Schmotrik, who's the finance minister. He said today, the time has come with Trump's election for Israel to annex the West Bank. And I think that's the dream of Netanyahu's supporters, is that that's what Trump can deliver for them. Originally, that was the idea of the Abraham Accords, was that annexation of the West Bank would be part of the deal, and the UAE had the guts to say, if you do that, we're backing out. My friend, the UAE ambassador, wrote a public op-ed saying, if there's annexation, this deal is over. So, we'll have to see. I spent a week in the West Bank in December of last year, and it is painful to see just how little territory there is left. This idea that, someday we can have a two-state solution. There just isn't much land left. If it's like Swiss cheese in the West Bank. So, we live in hope. My big failing as a journalist is that I'm an optimist by nature. And in our business, you always say, if you smell the flowers, look for the funeral. Well, I'm still looking for the wedding. Trump is such an unpredictable person. There is a part of him that wants to make deals that, in the end, we'd say were a good thing. Part of the reason I want to stay in my business for a while longer is to try to keep these characters honest. To say one final thing, the people that Trump seems to have selected for his key positions are less crazy than some of the other people that he could have selected. That's not all that reassuring, but Mike Waltz is was super competent former special operations officer, was part of a bipartisan group of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans called With Honor, one of the best things that was going in Congress. He's worked cooperatively with Democrats since he got there. He's become more conservative, much more hawkish on China, but he's not a nut. Marco Rubio used to be the most strident critic of Trump, and then he has been kissing the ring now for a few years, but he has been a very responsible co-chairman or ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, works closely with Mark Warner. So, those are two key people. His chief of staff, Susie Wiles, seems to be on the sane side. The guy that they just selected today as head of the CIA, again, in the field of possible candidates, is one of the less dangerous. So, these are very hawkish people, except toward Russia. They share Trump's desire to make some deal with Russia to end the Ukraine war. This set of people, list of names is bad for Ukraine, bad for China. They're all stridently anti-China. Probably bad for Europe. Certainly good for Israel, and certainly good for Russia. So that'd be my list of who won and who lost over the last couple of days.
Oh, it was going so optimistically, and that you concluded it really shockingly in a scary way. We have time probably for 2 questions. So I have one question there, brief one. And a second question, I'm going to give one to the MacArthur table. We've got great people thinking about deterrence. So think of your deterrence question, because the second question is going to come back there. Go ahead, please, sir.
What can you tell us?
Grab the mic so the room can hear, please.
Thank you. What can you tell us about the attitude within the CIA, particularly with respect to human intelligence, about a president who has a casual relationship with security?
Good question.
I'm talking about how does the CIA feel about this?
Thank you.
So I've talked to a number of recently retired officers in the last couple of weeks who are in touch with their colleagues, and there's high anxiety. They ask people to risk their lives on the promise that their identities, their secrets will be absolutely controlled. And Trump obviously reduces that. He has the ability to demand access to everything. He's commander-in-chief. So I think there's a lot of concern. What I find more worrying is we depend on our liaison relationships with our intelligence partners, and they tend to share a lot with us because we have overwhelmingly the best intelligence gathering in terms of breadth of any country in the world. And will countries begin to stop sharing some of their secrets because they're afraid that we won't protect them, because they're afraid that Trump is acting against their interests? I mean, if Trump really goes hard against NATO, I can imagine NATO countries responding at least, at a minimum, by reducing their intelligence liaison with us, and that would be damaging. So, I think there's a lot of anxiety. Again, the person who Trump picked today, apparently, John Ratcliffe, among the range of candidates will be less scary for the intelligence professionals.
Thank you. Matt, please. Brandon, right over there.
Thanks. Great to see you, David. Let me ask about deterrence in the context of the Ukraine war, but also more broadly. How do we think about how to respond when deterrence fails? Jake Sullivan has talked about a response that would be catastrophic for Russia if Russia used nuclear weapons in Ukraine to try to deter Russia from using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But on the other hand, if we had to actually do that, then the United States is a direct belligerent in the war. Russia would feel like it had to respond in some way to reestablish its own deterrence. So if you could give us some insight into how people in the government are thinking about how do you actually respond when your deterrent threat hasn't worked and an adversary does one of the things you are trying to deter them from doing?
It's a great question, and it's one that is haunting. There's an argument that we have been self-deterring, that every time Putin threatens to use tactical nuclear weapons, we hold back from what we might otherwise do to help our really valiant allies who, the last time I was in Ukraine a couple months ago, I wrote that they're bleeding out. I mean, they are losing a whole generation of their best soldiers and officers. They can't continue this war for too much longer. So, I find this conundrum just deeply troubling. In the fall of 2022, Jake Sullivan was told by intelligence analysts that there was a 50-50 chance that Russia would use tactical nuclear weapons as its lines were collapsing in Kharkiv and in Kherson, that they were so close to the edge that that was the intelligence analyst decision, that the U.S. Immediately began contacting them. Mark Milley called General Gerasimov, his counterpart, Austin did the same thing. Jake did the same thing. There was sort of intense discussion. And Bill Burns, I'm told, warned his counterpart, if you do this, here's what the consequences will be. And it would be devastating. It would be conventional, but devastating. So, you know, we've been on that balance. I think this has been the most dangerous time, certainly since 1962. We have been closer to actual use of nuclear weapons than at any time since then. That's been on Jake Sullivan's and others' shoulders, and I think they've done really well. They get criticized for, you know, well, why don't you let the Ukrainians fire the ATACMS missiles all the way into Russia? Well, the answer is because they're worried about Russian escalation that would take us into this zone of possible use of nuclear weapons. And I think it's right for the president to do what he can, everything he can, to avoid that. But you know, you'd have to say, in simple answer to your question, that our efforts to deter Russia have failed. That Israel's efforts to deter Iran from ever attacking Israeli territory have failed. We're in a new period where deterrence isn't working, and it's deeply worrying. What's the right response to that? Since this is the last question, I just want to say one thing, Rachel. So this is a period where I think all of us are really worried about the future, and I just want to note that it's tremendously encouraging to come here tonight and see your organization and hear a discussion of all the things that you do to help people think about dangers ahead for the country. You know, so you know you get so down sitting in Washington. You know, what your organization does, the people that you bring together is a reason that people like me feel some hope going forward, no matter what. So thank you for me.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank David Ignatius.